Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Volume 1 of The Books of Blood by Clive Barker. Now, The Books of Blood is a 6-volume collection of short stories, which was published between 1984 and 1985, and the stories, of course, were written by British horror author Clive Barker. Now, here in the States, volumes 4 and 5 of this series were published under the titles The Inhuman Condition and In the Flesh. Also, here in the States, some but not all of the stories from Volume 6 of the Books of Blood were published as extra stories at the end of Clive Barker's novel Cabal. Now, the Books of Blood really is what put Clive Barker on the map. Like, the stories from these collections really are what got people, at least in America, to really start noticing Clive Barker. Clive Barker would go on to write many other books, including The Hellbound Heart, which was the basis for the first Hellraiser movie, and Weave World and Cabal, which I just mentioned, and Cold Heart Canyon. Now, when these books first came out, Stephen King famously called Clive Barker the future of horror fiction. And Stephen King wrote a review on the Books of Blood, and there's a specific quote from his review that I think is really interesting. He says, "What Barker does in the Books of Blood makes the rest of us look like we've been asleep for the last 10 years. I personally really like that quote because in a lot of ways I do kind of agree with it. Now, Barker is often mentioned in the same vein as people like Stephen King and Dean Koontz, and I love Stephen King and I love Dean Koontz, but to me what really separates the works of Clive Barker from the works of Stephen King and Dean Koontz and other horror writers is there's a real philosophy to Clive Barker's work. To me, it's the same thing that separates H.P. Lovecraft from the other pulp writers of his time. It's the same thing that separates Alan Moore from other comic book writers like Frank Miller and Grant Morrison. It's the same thing that separates David Cronenberg from people like John Carpenter and Wes Craven and Tobe Hooper is the artist I have mentioned, Clive Barker, H.P. Lovecraft, Alan Moore, and David Cronenberg. These are artists who present a very compelling philosophy in their work. Like, Clive Barker goes places in his stories that I honestly feel people like Stephen King are afraid to go, and that's not me putting down Stephen King because if you know me, you know I'm a diehard Stephen King fan, but I think Stephen King would be the first person to admit that, and he honestly does kind of admit that in his review of the Books of Blood. And I do think Barker's homosexuality really does inform his stories because Clive Barker is a gay man who grew up in a time where that really wasn't accepted, so I think Barker knows what it's like to be an outsider, probably way more than people like Stephen King or Dean Koontz ever will. So this review is on Volume 1 of the Books of Blood, and as is the case with most of my reviews on short story collections, I'm going to be talking about each individual story from this book. So, the first story in this collection is titled The Book of Blood, and this one actually acts as sort of a frame story for all the other stories in this collection. The Book of Blood is about this psychic researcher who is investigating a haunted house, and she hires this man who claims to be a psychic medium, but it turns out he's actually a fraud. And what happens is this man actually ends up getting attacked by ghosts, and the ghosts end up carving words into his body, turning him into a human book. Like, essentially, they carve stories into his body, and the stories that they carve on his body are the stories that you read in the rest of the Books of Blood series. Like, basically, you're kind of supposed to assume that all these stories from the Books of Blood all take place in the same world, and these ghosts that attack this man in the first story, they're supposed to be the ghost of all the people who died in all the other stories, and essentially they're carving their stories into his body. Now, I'll be honest, this one was actually my least favorite story from the collection. It wasn't bad, but it really didn't go beyond anything more than just a frame story, and don't get me wrong, I thought the idea was brilliant, like the idea of a human book, and the idea of using this as sort of the framework for the rest of the stories. The idea was brilliant, but overall, I thought the story was just okay. I definitely think the other stories in this collection are better. Now, Clive Barker wrote a sequel to this story titled On Jerusalem Street, which was published at the end of Volume 6 of the Books of Blood, and both this story and On Jerusalem Street act as sort of bookends to the entire Books of Blood series. Now, both this story and On Jerusalem Street were adapted into the 2008 film Book of Blood. Now, the second story in the collection is titled The Midnight Meat Train, and this is where the book really started to pick up for me. Now, the plot of The Midnight Meat Train is it's set in New York City, and it follows these two men named Kaufman and Montgomery, and Kaufman is an office worker, and Montgomery is a serial killer. And it appears that Montgomery serves a higher purpose, like, it appears that he serves something much bigger than himself, but that's all I want to say about the story. But let's just say that Kaufman and Montgomery do eventually cross paths in the story after Kaufman falls asleep on a subway train, and once again, that's all I want to say about the story, but the ending of the story is very, very Lovecraftian. But yeah, The Midnight Meat Train was an excellent story, and if you get this collection, I almost recommend skipping over the first story and just starting with this one. Now, this story was adapted into a 2008 film of the same name. Now, the movie The Midnight Meat Train actually had Bradley Cooper in it, and I think this was really before Bradley Cooper really took off as a big star. Now, I remember the film adaptation of this story being okay. Like, I liked it, but I didn't love it, but I know the movie has a pretty big cult following. Like, there are a lot of people who really love that movie, so I should really give the movie another chance. The thing is that the movie had a lot of really bad CGI effects, and I think that really sort of turned me off to the movie, but I should really give the film a second chance. Now, the third story in the collection is titled The Yattering and Jack. Now, the Yattering and Jack follows this demon known as the Yattering, who is trying to terrorize this man named Jack, but it turns out this demon is failing miserably. Now, it turns out that one of Jack's ancestors made a deal with Beelzebub, and now Beelzebub is sending the Yattering after him, and the Yattering is trying to drive Jack insane, which would allow him to take Jack's soul to hell, but for some reason, nothing is working on Jack, and it appears that Jack is just oblivious to the Yattering's hauntings. But it turns out that Jack is actually a lot smarter than the Yattering is giving him credit for, and it turns out that Jack is just choosing to ignore this demon, but things get complicated when Jack's daughters come over for Christmas, and the Yattering starts threatening Jack's daughters. Now, unlike a lot of the other stories in this collection, which are pretty dark, this one is actually a really funny story. Like, this one is definitely more of a comedy than the other stories in the collection. And the story is absolutely brilliant, and just seeing how frustrated the Yattering is getting when he's trying to haunt Jack and nothing's working on him is actually really hilarious. Once again, it's a brilliant and hilarious story. Now, this story was adapted into an episode of the anthology series Tales from the Dark Side. Now, the fourth story in the collection is titled Pig Blood Blues. Now, the plot of Pig Blood Blues is it's about this ex-cop named Redman who gets a job at this, like, juvenile correctional facility, and he ends up meeting this young man named Lacey who is constantly bullied at the correctional facility, and let's just say he's terrified of somebody named Hennessy, who is a young man who supposedly disappeared, but Lacey claims that Hennessy actually killed himself, and in the story there's this giant pig in this sty, and let's just say that this pig has something to do with Hennessy. That's all I want to say about the story. But Pig Blood Blues is an excellent story, and in the story I saw sort of a commentary on the cruelty of youth, and the story actually reminded me a little bit of Lord of the Flies in a way. And also, the title of the story is really interesting because it sort of has a double meaning, because the word pig in the title could be referring to the villain of the story, which is this giant pig, but it could also be referring to Redman himself, because pig, of course, is a derogatory term for cop, and there are even points in the story where some of the boys at this correctional facility say, "That's the pig," when they're referring to Redman. Now, the fifth story in the collection is titled Sex, Death, and Starshine, and this one is about this stage director who is trying to direct a production of William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. But he runs into a lot of problems, one of them being that the main actress who is playing the protagonist of Twelfth Night is a horrible actress, but the reason she's even in this is because she's a former soap opera star, but she can't act to save her life, and he's also having an affair with her, and it turns out that the producer of the play really only cares about money, and a lot of the actors really don't give too much of a shit. And eventually the director of this play meets this stranger who has faith that he could direct a good play, but he says that his wife would be a much better Viola. Viola is the name of the protagonist from Twelfth Night, and let's just say that this stranger that he meets and his wife have been dead for years, and they're actually zombies. But Sex, Death, and Starshine was an excellent story, and in the story you get sort of this weird idea of the union between the sexual and the spiritual, which is sort of a common theme in a lot of Clive Barker's stories. And in this story, you do get a very interesting commentary on theater life and the differences between people who do what they do because they genuinely love the art and people who just do it for the money, and you get this commentary on the whole idea of art versus commerce. And in the story, Barker definitely takes the idea of an actor's legacy living forever to a literal extreme. And the ending of this story is strangely optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. But yeah, once again, Sex, Death, and Starshine is an excellent story, and it sort of reminded me a little bit of another Clive Barker novel titled Cold Heart Canyon, which Barker wrote years later. Like, Cold Heart Canyon was obviously about Hollywood, whereas this story is really about the theater, but I would say both stories are somewhat similar in theme. Sorry about the noise of the vacuum in the background, I can't really help that, but the sixth and final story of Volume 1 of the Books of Blood is titled In the Hills, the Cities, and dear God, this had to be the best story, in my opinion, of Volume 1 of the Books of Blood. This story was amazing and shockingly original. But the plot of this story is it's about this gay couple who have hit sort of a rough patch in their relationship, mainly because they both have very different views of the world. But what happens is they're on a road trip through Eastern Europe, and let's just say they come across something involving these two cities, and that's all I want to say about this story, because I feel like saying anything else will give too much away. But this is one of the most original stories I have ever read, and the fact that this idea was in somebody's head, I think is both amazing and terrifying. Like, the story is absolutely brilliant, and I feel like if it was in the hands of any other writer, the story would have been absolutely ludicrous, but Clive Barker manages to take the ludicrous in this story and make it kind of believable. I mean, the premise is pure fantasy, but at the same time, though, the fact that somebody conceived this idea is kind of terrifying. And I really don't think I've ever read anything quite like this story. The closest I can think of is, it did remind me a little bit of something that Junji Ito would have written. Junji Ito is a Japanese horror writer who is primarily known for his horror mangas, and some of his stories are somewhat similar to this story, but not exactly. But really, the works of Junji Ito, that's the closest that I can compare this story to. And I think the fact that the two main characters of this story are a gay couple is so important considering when this story was written, because this story was written in the 80s, and in the 80s, I think people were sort of starting to accept homosexuality a little bit, but it was still considered to be very underground. And here you have a story that was written for general readers, and you have two gay characters who are not done as stereotypes. I feel like that was so important for the time this story was published. But once again, In the Hills, the Cities, I think is easily the best story of Volume 1 of the Books of Blood. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video that there is a very specific philosophy to Clive Barker's stories, and I feel like a lot of Barker's stories definitely deal with sort of an outsider philosophy, but they also sort of deal with this philosophy that the sexual and the spiritual are a lot closer than we think, and a lot of the philosophy that you see in Barker's stories also deal with accepting your fate, no matter how grim your fate might actually be, and I think you see that philosophy very much reflected in the 6 stories of this collection. But yeah, that was my review on Volume 1 of the Books of Blood, and bye.